Hi, I'm Toro, and welcome to Toro's History Lullabies. All my life, I've needed a little background noise to fall asleep. For years, it was just the hum of a fan or some soft static. But ever since wireless earbuds came into my life, I've found myself drifting off to podcasts and documentaries, learning and relaxing at the same time. That's why I started making these videos. Calming stories from history, told gently, to help you unwind, learn something new, and hopefully fall asleep a little easier. So get comfortable, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's step quietly into the past. And if you enjoy these stories, I'd love it if you gave the video a like and subscribed for more. Sweet dreams. Korean War. Chapter 1, Divided by Victory. Part 1, The Peninsula Before the Storm. Long before the first gunshot of the Korean War echoed across the 38th parallel, long before American GIs faced waves of Chinese soldiers in the frozen hills of North Korea, and long before Korea became a geopolitical fault line in the Cold War, the Korean Peninsula was a land caught between giants. For centuries, Korea had been a pawn, a prize, and a battlefield between larger powers, China, Japan, Russia. But by the early 20th century, it had been utterly consumed. In 1910, Korea ceased to exist as an independent nation. It was not defeated in battle by another Asian kingdom. Instead, it was colonized, swallowed whole by the Empire of Japan. What followed was 35 years of rule that Koreans still refer to as the Dark Period, a time of cultural suppression, forced labor, and quiet resistance. The Japanese occupation was thorough. Korean schools were shuttered or converted into tools of indoctrination. Korean names were replaced by Japanese ones. Rice harvests were taken to feed the Japanese Empire, while Korean farmers went hungry. Those who resisted, poets, monks, students, were imprisoned or killed. By the 1930s, Tokyo had begun using Korean labor to feed its growing imperial ambitions. Koreans were sent to Japanese factories, or conscripted to build railways in Manchuria. Some were even drafted into the Japanese military. And then came the war, the Big War. Part 2, Liberation and Uncertainty, 1945. In August 1945, World War II ended with the sudden fury of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan capitulated, and its vast empire crumbled in days. For Korea, this moment was supposed to be a new dawn, a long-awaited liberation. But what came next was confusion, occupation, and ultimately, division. Korea was free, but it was also vulnerable. There was no independent Korean government waiting in the wings, no army to fill the vacuum. The Korean people, scattered and exhausted, waited for their future to be decided not by themselves, but by foreign powers. Again. On August 10, 1945, just 5 days before Japan's surrender, two young U.S. Army officers in Washington, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, were given an impossible task: figure out how to divide Korea between the Soviets and Americans. With no experts and no time, they pulled out a National Geographic map and chose the 38th parallel, a line that conveniently split the peninsula in half and left the capital, Seoul, under American control. To them, it was just a line on a map. To Koreans, it would become a wound that never truly healed. The Soviets moved quickly into the north, and the Americans landed in the south. Each side promised it was only temporary. But in the murky fog of post-war politics, nothing was truly temporary. Part 3, Two Koreas, Two Visions. In the Soviet-occupied North, a young man named Kim Il-sung rose to prominence. He was charismatic, ruthless, and had spent the war years fighting the Japanese as a guerrilla in Manchuria, though much of his legend was Soviet-crafted. The Soviets installed him as head of the Korean People's Committee in 1946. Kim had the backing of Moscow and the fire of Marxist ideology behind him. His dream was of a unified, Socialist Korea, with himself at its head. In the South, the Americans faced a different challenge. They didn't have a clear Korean leader ready to step in. Eventually, they found Syngman Rhee, a Princeton-educated Korean nationalist who had spent decades in exile, lobbying for Korean independence. Rhee was fiercely anti-communist, deeply authoritarian, and already in his 70s. But he spoke English and had a powerful sense of destiny. Washington, hungry for stability and friendly faces, supported him. By 1948, the division had hardened. The United Nations attempted to hold elections across Korea, but the North refused to participate. In the South, the Republic of Korea, ROK, was declared in August, with Syngman Rhee as its president. A month later, the North responded by founding the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, with Kim Il-sung as premier. Two governments. Two ideologies. Two armies. One people, split by foreign hands. Part 4, Brewing Tensions. Between 1948 and 1950, the Korean peninsula simmered with conflict. Border skirmishes along the 38th parallel were common, with both sides accusing the other of provocations. Each leader saw the other as illegitimate, and both believed they had a divine or historical right to unify Korea. Kim Il-sung, ambitious and bold, lobbied Joseph Stalin relentlessly for permission to invade the South. At first, Stalin was hesitant. The United States had troops in Japan and influence in South Korea. But by early 1950, the geopolitical chessboard had shifted. The Soviets had successfully tested their first atomic bomb in 1949. Mao Zedong's Communist Party had won the Chinese Civil War, establishing the People's Republic of China. The U.S. had reduced its forces in Korea to a skeleton presence. And in January 1950, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson gave a speech that listed America's defense perimeter in Asia, but did not include South Korea. Kim saw a green light. Stalin, calculating that the Americans wouldn't intervene, gave his cautious approval. Mao was informed, and eventually agreed to support if necessary. The plan was simple and brutal: strike fast, seize Seoul, and unify Korea before the world could react. Part 5, A Quiet Morning Before the Fire. In the final days of peace, the Korean peninsula was uneasy but unaware. Farmers in the south were preparing for the rice planting season. American advisors were scattered across ROK army units, trying to build a force capable of defending the republic. But few believed war was imminent. June 24, 1950, was a Saturday. The skies were calm. The rivers ran full. In Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung gave the final orders. In Seoul, people went to sleep not knowing that history was about to lurch violently forward. In the early morning hours of June 25, 1950, North Korean artillery opened up a barrage along the 38th parallel. Tanks, Soviet-made T-34s, rolled across the border in waves. Infantry followed, thousands of them. The invasion had begun. And just like that, Korea was no longer a pawn on the map. It was a battlefield again. Chapter 2, The Spark, June 25, 1950. Part 1, The Invasion Begins. The thunder came not from the sky, but from the north. At around 4 a.m. on June 25, 1950, North Korean artillery along the 38th parallel erupted in a coordinated barrage. Shells fell on South Korean outposts, bridges, and communication lines. It was a Sunday morning, and across the peninsula, most people were asleep. By sunrise, North Korean T-34 tanks had begun crossing into the south in dense columns, crushing roads and resistance beneath their treads. The invasion was swift, brutal, and overwhelming. North Korea's Korean People's Army, KPA, had trained relentlessly for this moment. With over 135,000 troops, well equipped with Soviet tanks, artillery, and aircraft, it outnumbered and outgunned its southern counterpart. The Republic of Korea Army, ROKA, by contrast, was woefully underprepared. They had no tanks, few anti-tank weapons, and only limited artillery. The United States had deliberately avoided arming them too heavily, fearing it might provoke the North, or embolden Syngman Rhee to attack first. When the attack began, Roca units along the front tried to hold the line, but most were quickly overrun. Units collapsed, scattered, or retreated. Some soldiers fled without firing a shot. Others stood and died in place. In Seoul, chaos spread like wildfire. Within hours, news of the invasion reached President Syngman Rhee, who ordered an immediate mobilization, but there was little he could do. American advisors relayed the situation to Washington, but the response would take time. By the evening of June 25, the North Koreans had advanced more than 20 miles in some areas. Civilians streamed south by the thousands, carrying whatever they could. Families were split. Children cried in confusion. No one knew where safety lay. Part 2, Washington reacts. Half a world away, the first reports hit Washington like a jolt. President Harry S. Truman, still early in his second term, was in Independence, Missouri, for the weekend. When his advisors reached him with the news, the significance of the moment was immediately clear. This was not just a border skirmish. This was a full-scale invasion, and it was happening on the watch of the United States. Truman, who had already seen the beginning of the Cold War in Europe, understood the stakes. If the US let this stand, where would Soviet aggression go next? Japan? West Germany? Would this make America look weak? Would communism seem unstoppable? The United Nations Security Council was convened within hours. The Soviet delegate, ironically, was boycotting the council at the time, protesting the UN's refusal to recognize Communist China. Without a Soviet veto, the council quickly passed UN Security Council Resolution 82, condemning the invasion and demanding a withdrawal of North Korean forces. 2 days later, Resolution 83 recommended military assistance. It was a thin legal thread, but it was enough. Truman moved quickly. By June 27, the United States was at war, though no formal declaration was made. Truman called it a police action. But no one would mistake what came next for anything less than war. Part 3, The Fall of Seoul. Back in Korea, the KPA was closing in fast. On June 28, just 3 days after the invasion, the North Koreans entered Seoul. The city fell with shocking speed. ROK forces, in a desperate effort to slow the enemy, blew up the Hangang Bridge, with hundreds of civilians still on it. It was a panic-driven act that cost untold lives and sowed further chaos. Syngman Rhee had already evacuated to the south, promising resistance would continue. But the mood in Seoul was grim. Many civilians, especially those who had supported the South Korean government, feared what would come next. Executions, arrests, and retribution soon followed. North Korean political cadres moved in behind the troops to cleanse the population. The ease with which Seoul fell stunned American military planners. This wasn't a slow-burn insurgency, it was a blitzkrieg, and South Korea was buckling. Part 4, Task Force Smith and the American Entry. The first American response came in early July, in the form of a hastily assembled unit called Task Force Smith, named after its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Brad Smith. Comprised of 540 undertrained, under-equipped U.S. soldiers, many of them barely out of basic training, the task force was sent to a small town called Osan, 30 miles south of Seoul. On July 5, 1950, they made contact with the North Koreans. It was a disaster. The Americans had a few 105mm howitzers and outdated bazookas, which proved utterly ineffective against the KPA's Soviet T-34 tanks. When the first tank was hit and shrugged it off, American troops began to panic. After just a few hours of fighting, the task force was overrun. Many soldiers were killed, captured, or forced to flee. It was a bitter taste of reality. Task Force Smith had been sent to show resolve, but it only revealed how unprepared the U.S. military was for war in Asia. More American troops began pouring in, first from Japan, then from the States. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander for the Allied powers in Japan, was given control of UN forces. He viewed the war as a test of free will against communist aggression. Truman gave him wide latitude. The war was now global. And it was about to get worse. Part 5, The Retreat to Pusan. Throughout July and August 1950, the North Korean advance continued almost unchecked. Town after town fell as the KPA pushed south, their troops tireless and ruthless. The ROK Army and the newly arriving American forces tried to form defensive lines, but each one eventually collapsed. The heat was unbearable. The roads were clogged with refugees. Ammunition was short, morale was lower, and the terrain was brutal: mountains, valleys, rice paddies. But there was one final redoubt: the Pusan perimeter. By late August, UN forces had been pushed into a pocket in the far southeastern corner of Korea, centered around the port city of Pusan. It was here that they made their stand. The Pusan perimeter was held by a ragged but growing army of Americans, South Koreans, and a few international units, including British troops. They were reinforced constantly by sea through Pusan harbor. Supplies, tanks, fresh troops, they all flowed in. It was a brutal slugfest. The North Koreans tried again and again to punch through, but the perimeter held. American air superiority, naval support, and the slow arrival of better-trained divisions began to turn the tide. Still, the war's first months had been a catastrophe. Seoul was gone. Tens of thousands were dead. The South teetered on the edge of collapse. And then, just when the North thought it had won, MacArthur made his move. Chapter 3, Collapse and Resistance. Part 1, Holding the Line. The heat of the Korean summer gave no relief. In the hills and rice paddies surrounding the port city of Pusan, UN forces dug in, bracing for what felt like the end. It was August 1950. Seoul had fallen. Most of the peninsula was under North Korean control. The South Korean capital had been turned into an administrative outpost for Kim Il-sung's regime. To the world, it looked as though the war might be over before it had truly begun. But in the southeast, something held. The Pusan perimeter, a roughly horseshoe-shaped defensive line wrapped around the cities of Pusan, Taegu, and Masan, became the Alamo of the Korean War, a place where everything was thrown into the defense. By the end of July, nearly 180,000 troops, Americans, South Koreans, and a few allies, were crammed into this pocket. Every beachhead mattered. Every road was contested. General Walton Walker, commanding the 8th U.S. Army, issued a famously simple order: there will be no more retreating. There will be no Dunkirk. There will be no Bataan. A retreat to Pusan would be one of the greatest butcheries in history. We are going to hold this line. And so they did. North Korean forces launched relentless assaults throughout August. Some areas changed hands multiple times in a single day. UN air power, however, played a decisive role. American planes owned the skies, and they rained destruction on enemy columns. Bombers shredded supply lines, strafed troop concentrations, and disrupted attempts at coordinated offensives. Meanwhile, at sea, the U.S. Navy controlled the coasts. Ships brought in fresh supplies daily. Marines began landing. Morale, while frayed, stabilized. And behind the lines, a bold idea was taking shape. Part 2, A Gamble in the Shadows. General Douglas MacArthur was not known for modesty. The 70-year-old World War II hero had spent the post-war years ruling over Japan like a shogun, orchestrating reforms, and overseeing occupation. The Korean conflict pulled him back into active command, and MacArthur was determined to make it his masterpiece. While the world focused on the embattled Pusan perimeter, MacArthur began planning something audacious: a landing far behind enemy lines, at a place called Incheon. Incheon, just west of Seoul, was an unlikely target. The tides were treacherous. The harbor had a narrow channel, rocky approaches, and huge tidal swings, over 30 feet. Even the Joint Chiefs in Washington were skeptical. Naval commanders protested. Amphibious operations were notoriously risky, and Incheon was defended. But MacArthur was adamant. The enemy will never expect it, he said. His logic was sound. By late summer, the North Koreans had thrown nearly all their resources into the southern push. Their rear was thin, their supply lines long and exposed. A successful landing at Incheon could cut them off, trap their forces, and turn the tide of the war. The plan was codenamed Operation Chromite. It would be one of the boldest amphibious invasions since D-Day. Part 3, meanwhile, in the north. While the South struggled to hold, life in the newly liberated areas of North Korea took on a grim new tone. Political commissars followed the advancing troops, organizing purges of anyone suspected of collaboration with the South. Landlords were executed. Teachers disappeared. Churches were closed. Anyone seen as a threat to the new order was arrested, or worse. In Seoul, resistance was building underground. South Korean partisans passed intelligence to the Americans through secret networks. Some laid the groundwork for sabotage ahead of the coming liberation. Others were caught and executed. The brutality on both sides deepened, hardening the hatred that would define the rest of the war. Part 4, the first UN allies arrive. Though America provided the lion's share of troops, the United Nations effort was not American alone. In late summer 1950, British troops began arriving, followed by Australians, Canadians, Turks, Ethiopians, and others. In all, 21 nations would send combat or medical support to the war effort. This international presence gave the conflict the air of legitimacy that Truman and the UN needed. The world, in theory, was standing against aggression. For many of these soldiers, Korea was a place they'd barely heard of. For some, it was their first time seeing combat. For others, like the Gurkhas or the Royal Marines, it was just another war in a long string of them. But their presence mattered. And they would soon be tested in the crucible of the campaign to come. Part 5, the final push at Pusan. By early September, the North Koreans launched what would be their last major offensive of the early war, a desperate attempt to break the perimeter before the tides turned. They nearly succeeded. The Battle of the Nakdong River, on the western edge of the Pusan perimeter, was especially fierce. Hills were taken and retaken. South Korean forces fought with the fury of the damned, knowing that if the line broke, there would be nowhere left to run. American units used superior firepower, but casualties were high. Bodies piled up in the mud. Entire companies were wiped out. It was war in its most brutal, grinding form. But ultimately, the line held. And just as the North Koreans prepared to try again, Incheon rose like a hammer from the sea. Chapter 4, MacArthur's Gamble, the Incheon Landing. Part 1, the Masterstroke. In the war rooms of Tokyo, MacArthur laid out his plan like a chess grandmaster orchestrating a trap. His advisors, the Navy, even many in Washington thought the move was reckless, some said impossible. But MacArthur believed in boldness. He believed in the element of surprise. And he believed that Incheon, despite its narrow, tide-racked harbor, was the key to turning the war around. D-Day was set for September 15, 1950. The operation would involve over 70,000 troops, primarily U.S. Marines, supported by a vast naval armada of destroyers, cruisers, and aircraft carriers. Incheon's defenses were modest. The North Koreans didn't expect a landing there, it was too dangerous, too unlikely. That was the point. In the pre-dawn darkness, under a sliver of moonlight, waves of amphibious craft began pushing toward the shore. Naval guns opened fire on Wolmedo Island, the small fortress-like landmass guarding Incheon harbor. The island's defenders responded with machine guns and mortars, but they were quickly silenced by a torrent of shells. By mid-morning, Marines had secured the island. The main landing began hours later, timed carefully with the high tide. Landing craft struggled to reach the seawalls. Marines had to scale the walls under fire, tossing grenades into bunkers and clearing trenches by hand. But it worked. By nightfall, the beachhead was secured. North Korean defenders, shocked and unprepared, were in retreat. The road to Seoul now lay open. Part 2, The Liberation of Seoul. MacArthur wasted no time. Seoul was not just a strategic objective, it was symbolic. The capital had to be retaken. The battle for Seoul was fierce. From September 22 to 28, American Marines and South Korean forces fought street by street, block by block. North Korean troops had dug in, turning apartment buildings and factories into strongpoints. Snipers lurked in the windows. Booby traps filled alleyways. It was brutal urban warfare, something few American soldiers had ever seen. But the tide had turned. By the end of the month, Seoul was in UN hands again. The Republic of Korea flag flew over the Capitol building, and Syngman Rhee returned in triumph. To the world, it looked like victory. The invaders had been repelled. The capital was free. The line had not only held, it had reversed. But the war was far from over. Part 3, The Collapse of the KPA. While MacArthur's forces liberated Seoul, the 8th Army broke out from the Pusan perimeter and began a counteroffensive. Now it was the North Koreans' turn to flee. Cut off and outflanked, many KPA units disintegrated. Soldiers abandoned their weapons and fled north. Some melted into the hills, trying to evade capture. Others were slaughtered in massive sweeps. Roads filled with retreating columns. UN aircraft turned them into shooting galleries, the meat grinder, some pilots called it. Entire divisions vanished in the chaos. Prisoners were taken by the thousands. For a brief window, it seemed that the entire North Korean state might collapse. At MacArthur's urging, Truman gave approval to pursue the enemy north of the 38th parallel. The mission shifted. This wasn't just about defending South Korea anymore. It was about reunifying the peninsula, by force. Part 4, To the Yalu. The momentum was irresistible. By early October, UN forces crossed the 38th parallel. MacArthur, now at the height of his confidence, ordered a full push to the Yalu River, Korea's northernmost border with China. To many in Washington, this move was deeply risky. China had warned that any approach to its border would be viewed as a threat. But MacArthur dismissed the idea. He believed China wouldn't dare intervene. His intelligence staff believed the same. The Chinese, after all, had just come through a brutal civil war. Their military was exhausted. And they hadn't moved to protect North Korea yet. And so, the advance continued. American tanks rolled into Pyongyang on October 19. The capital of North Korea fell without much resistance. South Korean forces pushed along the east coast, while the U.S. 8th Army moved up the western half of the peninsula. The weather turned colder. Snow began to fall in the hills. Victory seemed inevitable. Troops joked that they'd be home by Christmas. But in the dark valleys near the Yalu, an invisible army was already watching them. Part 5, Warning from the North. Unbeknownst to most UN commanders, China had already made its decision. Mao Zedong, furious that hostile forces were approaching China's border, ordered the creation of the People's Volunteer Army, a massive force drawn from experienced PLA units, still bloodied from their civil war. Though technically volunteers, these troops were under direct Chinese command. In October, tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers began slipping across the Yalu River at night. Dressed in dark uniforms, carrying minimal gear, they moved silently through mountain passes and forest trails. American pilots couldn't spot them. Reconnaissance failed to detect their numbers. Some UN officers received reports of Chinese sightings, but many dismissed them as panicked rumors. On October 25, Chinese forces struck for the first time, ambushing South Korean troops near the town of Unsan. The attacks were sharp and surgical, then they disappeared back into the hills. American commanders weren't sure what they had encountered. It was a warning. The real blow was still to come. Chapter 5, China Enters the Dragon. Part 1, The Silent Avalanche. To the American and UN soldiers advancing through the hills of North Korea in November 1950, victory seemed a matter of time. Many units were nearing the banks of the Yalu River, just miles from the Chinese border. U.S. forces posed for photos beside mile markers labeled Yalu. South Korean troops dipped their boots in the freezing water. But overhead, there was a silence that should have been unsettling. The North Korean resistance had crumbled. Villages were deserted. No shots rang out. No enemy columns appeared on the roads. It felt too easy. And it was. Because hiding in the ridgelines, in forests of pine and snow, was a force unlike anything the Americans had faced, over 300,000 Chinese soldiers, waiting patiently, quietly, like snow about to fall. They were cold, undersupplied, and mostly traveled on foot. But they had the advantage of surprise, numbers, and terrain. They had studied the Americans. And they had a plan. They would attack all at once. Part 2, The Nightmare at Chosin. In late November, UN forces in the north were overextended and vulnerable. The U.S. X-Corps, under General Edward Almond, was spread thin along the eastern mountains, with its most exposed unit, the 1st Marine Division, positioned near the Chosin Reservoir. On the night of November 27, 1950, the sky lit up with muzzle flashes. Tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers descended on the Marines in wave after wave. Bugles blared in the night air. The Chinese often attacked without heavy weapons, swarming positions by sheer numbers. The cold was punishing, temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Fahrenheit -34 degrees Celsius, causing rifles to freeze and morphine syrettes to solidify in their metal tins. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir became legendary. Surrounded, outnumbered 6-1, the Marines fought through ambushes, frostbite, and exhaustion. Roads turned to ice. Evacuation was nearly impossible. Chinese soldiers crept through the hills, cutting supply lines. Dead bodies froze solid in grotesque positions. The Marines refused to break. When asked if they were retreating, Marine General Oliver Smith famously replied, "Retreat, hell. We're just attacking in a different direction." Over 2 brutal weeks, the Marines fought their way out, evacuating the wounded and dragging their dead. It was a tactical withdrawal, but a moral victory. The Chinese had taken enormous losses. Yet the larger picture was clear, the UN advance had collapsed. Part 3, The Great Retreat. As the scale of the Chinese intervention became clear, panic spread across the UN command. MacArthur was stunned. His intelligence estimates had failed catastrophically. This wasn't a token Chinese force, it was a massive, coordinated invasion. The 8th Army, under General Walker, found itself facing overwhelming numbers in the west. Chinese units moved like ghosts, appearing in valleys and vanishing into hills. Positions that had taken weeks to gain were abandoned in hours. A full-scale retreat began in December 1950. It became the longest withdrawal in U.S. Army history. Thousands of refugees followed the retreating columns, creating an endless human river moving southward. Villages were torched to deny the enemy shelter. Ammunition was thrown into rivers. Trucks broke down in the cold. Roads became clogged with vehicles and frightened civilians. On December 23, General Walton Walker died in a jeep accident, adding to the chaos. He was replaced by General Matthew Ridgway, a tough, aggressive officer with a paratrooper's mindset and a fierce will to fight. But even Ridgway couldn't stop what came next. Part 4, Seoul Falls, Again. By early January 1951, Chinese and North Korean forces surged south. Morale among UN troops wavered. Soldiers had been fighting for months without rest, in sub-zero conditions, with no end in sight. The Chinese seemed unstoppable. On January 4, Seoul fell for the second time in less than a year. The South Korean government evacuated. UN troops pulled back to more defensible positions south of the Han River. In the city, Chinese troops hoisted red flags and issued proclamations of liberation. Their presence, though initially welcomed by some, quickly turned harsh. Looting, food requisition, and political repression followed. It was a devastating psychological blow. To the American public, it looked like another defeat, another setback in a war that had promised to be over by Christmas. Calls for withdrawal grew louder. Truman's approval ratings plummeted. Some in Congress began talking openly of replacing him. The Cold War, already frigid, now felt like it might explode. And behind it all, MacArthur simmered. Part 5, The Breaking Point. By early 1951, the war had changed again. What began as a defense of South Korea had turned into a march to the Yalu, then a retreat to survive. MacArthur, frustrated and furious, publicly pushed for expanded war. He wanted to bomb Chinese cities, blockade Chinese ports, and even use nuclear weapons if necessary. He believed the Chinese must be defeated entirely, or else the US would look weak, inviting aggression elsewhere. Washington, however, feared a wider war, a Third World War. Truman and his advisers, including General Omar Bradley and Secretary of State Dean Acheson, argued that the objective had to return to containment, not conquest. Korea was important, but starting a general war with China, or provoking the Soviet Union, was unacceptable. This difference of vision would soon reach a breaking point. The military legend of World War II and the President of the United States were now on a collision course. But even as the political drama played out, the soldiers in the mud had no choice but to fight on. Chapter 6, Stalemate in the Ice. Part 1, A New Commander, A New Strategy. As the front lines shifted and the capital fell once more, the fate of Korea teetered on a knife's edge. The UN forces had been pushed to the brink, but they had not broken. Into the chaos stepped General Matthew B. Ridgway, a man known for his toughness, steel discipline, and paratrooper grit. He was a combat veteran who had jumped into Normandy on D-Day and believed in aggressive, mobile warfare. Where others saw disaster, Ridgway saw an opportunity to regroup, rearm, and push back. He changed everything. Ridgway took command of the 8th Army, revitalized its morale, and imposed strict discipline. He visited frontline units personally, checking foxholes and challenging defeatist thinking. He brought back fire into the hearts of exhausted soldiers. He also adapted tactics, used terrain, maintained supply lines, and keep flexible defensive positions. He relied on air power and artillery, and he made it clear. This was no longer a retreat. The goal was to hold the line and fight smart. While the Chinese had the numbers, Ridgway knew the UN had logistics, firepower, and air superiority. He would use them. Part 2, Operation Thunderbolt. In late January 1951, with Seoul under enemy control and the front barely stabilized south of the Han River, Ridgway launched Operation Thunderbolt. This wasn't a blind push north, it was a calculated advance aimed at testing Chinese strength and regaining lost ground. The goal was to push toward the Han, not recklessly, but methodically, inch by inch if needed. And it worked. The Chinese, who had exhausted themselves in their winter offensives, were now overextended and undersupplied. Their soldiers were often cold, hungry, and short on ammunition. The terrain that once helped them, mountains and rivers, now became obstacles in retreat. UN troops moved forward, clearing villages and hilltops, often engaging in vicious close-range battles. Flamethrowers, grenades, bayonets, all were common tools in the grim, intimate fighting of 1951. The tide began to turn, again. Part 3, MacArthur's Fall from Grace. While Ridgway led from the front, General Douglas MacArthur led from his Tokyo headquarters. And the rift between MacArthur and President Truman had become unbridgeable. MacArthur increasingly ignored directives from Washington. He issued public statements criticizing U.S. policy, called for expansion of the war into China, and corresponded with Republican lawmakers behind Truman's back. His prestige was immense. Many in America revered him as a hero. But he had gone too far. The breaking point came in April 1951, when MacArthur sent a letter, leaked to the press, directly challenging Truman's authority and calling for an end to appeasement. On April 11, Truman made the agonizing decision to relieve MacArthur of command. The backlash in the U.S. was immediate and explosive. MacArthur returned to a hero's welcome, paraded through ticker tape in New York City. He gave a famous farewell speech to Congress: "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." But Truman stood by his decision. Civilian control of the military had to be preserved. And Ridgway, now promoted to command the UN forces in Korea, would carry the war forward. Part 4, The Battle for Seoul, third time's the charm. By the spring of 1951, Ridgway's offensives were bearing fruit. In March, UN forces launched Operation Ripper, designed to retake Seoul for the third time. It wasn't just about reclaiming the city, it was about bleeding the Chinese and North Koreans in the process. The battle was harsh. Chinese forces, now deeply entrenched, fought with brutal determination. Seoul had become a broken, battered city, filled with rubble and the ghostly remnants of its former life. But after weeks of heavy fighting, the UN re-entered the capital. Seoul changed hands for the fourth and final time. The city was in ruins. Large sections had been flattened. Most of the population had fled. The few who remained were living in underground shelters or sifting through the wreckage for food. This was what liberation looked like now: ashes and silence. Part 5, Stalemate. By mid-1951, the war had entered a strange and bitter phase. The fighting continued, but the front lines barely moved. The Chinese launched another offensive in April, hoping to push UN forces back toward the south again. The battles that followed, Imjin River, Kapyong, Pork Chop Hill, were bloodbaths. UN soldiers, including British, Australian, and Canadian troops, held their positions against overwhelming odds. In some areas, hilltops changed hands multiple times in a single week. Artillery fire thundered day and night. Trenches were dug. Bunkers fortified. The war, once mobile, became a grinding war of attrition. The line stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel. And so began a paradox: talks of peace began, even as the killing continued. In July 1951, truce negotiations opened in Kaesong, later moving to Panmunjom. But they dragged on for months, then years. The issues were complex, especially prisoners of war, many of whom didn't want to be repatriated. Neither side trusted the other. Each wanted to gain leverage on the battlefield to push terms in their favor at the table. And so, the dying continued. Soldiers huddled in frozen trenches. Planes bombed railways. Snipers waited silently in the fog. Villages were burned, rebuilt, and burned again. The war had no clear end in sight. Chapter 7, The Forgotten Front. Part 1, Life in the Trenches. By late 1951, the Korean War had entered a new kind of hell. Gone were the sweeping invasions and dramatic landings. Gone were the quick collapses and counteroffensives. Now the war settled into a static, miserable stalemate, not unlike the Western Front of World War I. Along a jagged, mountainous line that stretched across the peninsula, from the Yellow Sea in the west to the Sea of Japan in the east, UN and Communist forces dug in. They fought for hills with names like Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, and Old Baldy. They built bunkers deep into the earth, stringing barbed wire along muddy slopes and laying minefields in frozen ravines. Soldiers spent days or weeks without seeing the sun, crouched in trenches and listening to artillery fall on distant ridges. Patrols were sent out nightly into no man's land to test enemy positions, gather intelligence, or capture prisoners. Some never returned. Snipers haunted the daylight. Rain turned everything into a swamp. Winter froze hands to rifles. Summer brought flies, lice, and the stench of rotting corpses no one could retrieve. It was war reduced to its most elemental: kill, survive, endure. Part 2, the Air War. Above the mud and barbed wire, a different war was being waged, a war for the skies. The U.S. Air Force launched massive bombing campaigns against North Korea's infrastructure. Bridges, rail yards, hydroelectric dams, factories, anything that might support the communist war effort was targeted. B-29 superfortresses rumbled across the sky, unleashing destruction day and night. In response, MiG-15 fighters, piloted by North Koreans, Chinese, and in some cases, Soviet, volunteers, engaged UN aircraft in high-speed dogfights. The airspace over northwestern Korea became known as MiG Alley. There, elite American pilots flying F-86 Sabres clashed with communist fighters in battles that tested the very edge of aviation technology. The Sabre pilots, many of them World War II veterans, developed aggressive new tactics to match the MiG's speed and altitude advantage. One American ace, Captain Joseph McConnell, scored 16 kills. Another, James Jabara, became the first American jet ace in history. But victory came at a cost. Many planes went down over enemy territory, and captured pilots were sometimes used for propaganda or held in brutal prison camps. Despite fierce resistance, UN air supremacy remained largely unchallenged. But that did not end the suffering on the ground. Part 3, the Prisoner Dilemma. By mid-1952, the truce talks, still dragging on in Panmunjom, were deadlocked on one major issue: prisoners of war, POWs. The UN insisted on the principle of voluntary repatriation. No POW should be forced to return to a country they didn't want to go back to. Many North Korean and Chinese prisoners refused repatriation, fearing execution or persecution at home. The Communists demanded full repatriation, insisting all prisoners must be returned regardless of their wishes. For Mao and Kim Il-sung, the refusal of their soldiers to return was an embarrassment, a blow to the legitimacy of their regimes. The camps where these prisoners were held became scenes of intense political drama, and sometimes violence. Communist prisoners staged uprisings, waving red flags and singing revolutionary songs. Pro-democracy prisoners clashed with them or tried to escape. American and South Korean guards, uncertain how to manage these factions, were sometimes overwhelmed. The tension in the camps mirrored the larger war: frozen, bitter, ideologically intractable. Part 4, a world watching, or forgetting. Back in the United States, the Korean War, now over 2 years old, was fading from the headlines. The American public, still reeling from World War II and bracing for a nuclear future, had grown weary. Newspapers called Korea the Forgotten War. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't decisive. It wasn't even clear who was winning, or why it hadn't ended. The draft continued. Coffins kept arriving. But parades stopped. Patriotism became quieter. Even the politicians who had once championed the war grew cautious. In Korea itself, the cost was horrific. Cities like Pyongyang, Wonsan, and Sinuiju were leveled by bombings. Civilians lived in caves and dugouts. Farms were abandoned. Bridges were rebuilt again and again, only to be bombed again. Entire families disappeared. In the South, the story was different but still painful. Seoul had changed hands 4 times. Many lived in squalid refugee camps. Disease was rampant. Orphans wandered the countryside in rags, begging from passing soldiers. And all the while, the war dragged on. Part 5, holding the line. Through 1952 and into early 1953, the front line remained largely static, but the killing never stopped. Chinese and North Korean forces launched limited offensives to gain leverage at the truce table. UN forces responded in kind. Battles like White Horse Hill, Triangle Hill, and the Hook became epic, bloody affairs, dozens of men dying for inches of terrain. One of the most infamous was the Battle of Pork Chop Hill in the spring of 1953. American troops, including many young draftees, fought wave after wave of Chinese assaults on a small, rugged outcropping. The hill itself had little strategic value, but symbolically, it mattered deeply. Hundreds died for it. And even after it was taken, it would be abandoned later, as the truce neared. The war had become a theater of sacrifice, every casualty a negotiation tool, every hill a bargaining chip. Chapter 8, The Long Truce. Part 1, The New President. By early 1953, the war had dragged on for nearly 3 years. For those fighting it, the conflict had become a bitter rhythm of gunfire, boredom, and death. And for the public in the United States, the frustration was turning into fury. In November 1952, Americans elected a new president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the revered supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe during World War II. He campaigned on a simple promise: I will go to Korea. He didn't say how he'd fix it, but the idea of a tough, steady hand appealed to a country growing weary of endless war. True to his word, Eisenhower visited Korea in December 1952. He flew over the battle-scarred land, met with generals, and spoke to soldiers in the snow. What he saw confirmed what he already suspected: there was no easy military victory to be had. His goal was not conquest, it was an honorable peace. Part 2, Back-channel messages. Behind the scenes, peace efforts had been slowly inching forward. The biggest obstacle remained: the fate of prisoners of war. After nearly 2 years of negotiations, the impasse was still unresolved. But with Eisenhower in office, the American tone shifted subtly. The new administration made it clear that if talks continued to fail, they were willing to consider other means, which included the use of tactical nuclear weapons. This wasn't a bluff to be taken lightly. Meanwhile, events in the communist world were changing rapidly. On March 5, 1953, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin died. His death sent shockwaves through the communist bloc. Power struggles began in Moscow. The Kremlin's appetite for an endless war in Korea suddenly weakened. Within weeks, the tone at the negotiating table changed. North Korea and China, now without Stalin's pressure to maintain the fight, became more flexible. Secret diplomatic channels opened wider. The idea of a compromise on POWs began to take root. The war, for the first time in years, seemed to be inching toward its end. Part 3, The Final Battles. Even as negotiations progressed, the fighting intensified. Both sides wanted to strengthen their bargaining position by holding the most advantageous ground possible. Thus began a series of bloody final offensives. One of the most iconic was the Battle of Outpost Harry, in June 1953. Held by a single U.S. infantry company, the small hill was attacked by thousands of Chinese soldiers over 8 nights. The defenders held, barely, at horrific cost. South Korean forces also launched their own attacks, sometimes against the wishes of American commanders. President Syngman Rhee remained adamantly opposed to any truce that didn't reunify Korea. He feared an armistice would leave the peninsula forever divided, and his position forever precarious. In an act of protest, Rhee even released 25,000 anti-communist POWs, effectively sabotaging the negotiations in June. But despite the outburst, Washington pushed forward. Rhee was pressured, isolated, and ultimately forced to accept that peace was coming, with or without him. Part 4, The Armistice. On July 27, 1953, in a plain building in Panmunjom, the armistice was finally signed. The agreement called for an immediate ceasefire, The establishment of a demilitarized zone, DMZ, roughly along the existing front lines. The creation of a military armistice commission to monitor the ceasefire. The repatriation of POWs who wished to return, and the resettlement of those who didn't. The war was over. There was no victory parade. No peace treaty. No reunification. Just an agreement to stop killing each other. By the time the guns fell silent, nearly 5 million people had died. Over 36,000 Americans were dead, and 100,000 wounded. South Korea had lost over 217,000 soldiers, and more than 1 million civilians. North Korea and China had suffered at least 1.5 million casualties, possibly more. Entire cities had been flattened, rivers poisoned, forests burned. The Korean peninsula was no longer a battlefield, but it was not at peace. Part 5, Aftermath on the Ground. Across Korea, families emerged from hiding. Villages buried their dead. Orphans wandered from hut to hut, looking for food or names they recognized. The cities were unrecognizable. Seoul, which had changed hands 4 times, was a shell. In the north, communist authorities rebuilt swiftly, using Chinese support and Soviet aid. A harsh dictatorship took root. Surveillance intensified. Propaganda saturated schools and homes. Kim Il-sung emerged stronger than ever, eventually declaring himself great leader for life. In the south, political chaos persisted. Syngman Rhee remained in power, clamping down on dissent and ruling with increasing authoritarianism. But the seeds of economic reform and foreign investment, fueled by American aid, began to sprout. And between them lay the demilitarized zone, a 2.5-mile-wide scar, lined with barbed wire, watchtowers, and landmines. It was a no-man's land guarded by tens of thousands of troops, where birds sometimes crossed, but people never did. The war was frozen in time. Chapter 9, The War After the War. Part 1, 2 Koreas, 1 wound. When the guns fell silent on July 27, 1953, nothing was truly resolved. Korea remained a divided nation, its people separated by ideology, barbed wire, and the ruins of war. In the north, the destruction was almost total, but so was the grip of the state. Kim Il-sung, now revered as a revolutionary hero, used the war to justify absolute control. He portrayed the conflict as a victory against imperialism, glossing over the massive casualties and devastation his regime had caused. The government rebuilt rapidly with Soviet and Chinese assistance, creating a rigid command economy. The military was expanded, propaganda intensified, and the cult of personality around Kim took root. Schools taught the glory of the Fatherland Liberation War. Children were taught to hate Americans and believe that the North had won. In the South, the rebuilding was slower, but it came. Seoul, though shattered, became a city of cranes and ambition. The government of Syngman Rhee cracked down on dissent and maintained emergency powers, using the war as justification for silencing critics. But with U.S. aid flowing in, South Korea slowly began to modernize. Unlike the North, South Korea remained poor and unstable for years, but it also remained open to outside ideas, trade, and, eventually, democracy. The two Koreas, once culturally and linguistically identical, began to evolve in radically different directions. Part 2, A Divided People. One of the most tragic legacies of the Korean War was the separation of families. During the chaos of war, countless parents, children, and siblings had fled in different directions. Some were captured. Some defected. Others were simply stranded as the front shifted again and again. When the DMZ hardened into a permanent border, millions were trapped on the wrong side of history. For decades, there was no contact. No letters. No calls. No visits. Just silence. Only in later decades, under rare political thaws, did limited family reunions occur. These meetings were heartbreaking and surreal, brothers who hadn't seen each other in 50 years, mothers meeting sons who were now grandfathers. Most lasted only a few hours. Then the border reclosed. The war had ended in stalemate, but the pain lingered in every broken family, every unmarked grave. Part 3, The United States and the Cold War Pivot. For the United States, the Korean War changed everything. It was the first major armed conflict of the Cold War, and it reshaped American foreign policy for decades. Before Korea, the U.S. had been hesitant to commit troops abroad in peacetime. After Korea, the U.S. embraced a policy of permanent global presence. Troops remained stationed in South Korea. A vast military-industrial complex grew. The war proved that America would fight to contain communism, even in places far from home. Domestically, the war fed anti-communist hysteria. Senator Joseph McCarthy rose to prominence during the conflict, accusing government officials of being communist sympathizers. The Red Scare spread. Civil liberties were curtailed. Loyalty oaths became common. And yet, even as the war receded from memory, its impact remained embedded in America's strategic thinking, from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan. Korea had been a crucible. A proving ground. And a warning. Part 4, Veterans and Memory. For the soldiers who fought in Korea, the war never left them. Those who returned home were often met not with parades or praise, but with indifference. The conflict was overshadowed by the heroism of World War II and the controversy of Vietnam. Korea became known as the Forgotten War. Many veterans bore physical and psychological scars. They spoke of the cold, of the endless hills, of the friends left behind in the snow. Some never spoke at all. Years later, memorials would be built. Books would be written. Movies would try to capture the complexity. But for many who served, it remained a personal war, a war of survival, duty, and loss. In Washington, D.C., the Korean War Veterans Memorial, built in 1995, captures this quiet pain. 19 steel statues of soldiers, cloaked in ponchos, march across a field toward an unseen enemy, faces strained, eyes alert. Beneath them, an inscription reads, "Freedom is not free." Part 5 echoes today. To this day, no peace treaty has ever been signed. The Korean Demilitarized Zone is one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world. Over 1 million soldiers remain on alert on either side. Tensions flare with every missile test, every skirmish, every diplomatic insult. And yet, there are signs of thaw. In recent decades, there have been summit meetings between North and South. Olympic gestures. Family reunions. Even visits between presidents and supreme leaders. Hope flickers, then fades. The ghosts of the war still walk the hills of Korea. They linger in the divided families, the unhealed trauma, the unresolved border. They whisper in the silence of the DMZ, where birds sing and wild deer graze between bunkers. It was never just a civil war. It was a proxy war. A test of ideologies. A line drawn in blood between two competing visions of the future. And though the fighting stopped in 1953, the Korean War never truly ended. Epilogue, Ghosts on the Peninsula. When history looks back on the Korean War, it sees paradox. It was a war without victory. A war without surrender. A war that began with fire and ended in frost. It was a war where nations rose and fell, where millions died for lines on a map, where ideology crushed humanity again and again. It left a peninsula scarred and a world forever changed. And yet, it was not in vain. South Korea, against all odds, emerged from dictatorship to become a thriving democracy and economic power. North Korea, isolated and authoritarian, became a reminder of what might have been had the war gone the other way. The Korean War was a story of tragedy and resilience, of bold mistakes and desperate courage, of global politics and individual sacrifice. It may be forgotten by many. But for those who lived it, for those who still live with its consequences, it remains as vivid as ever. The war after the war continues. But so does the hope that one day, finally, the Korean people may write their own ending. Thanks for spending a little time with me tonight. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like and subscribe for more gentle journeys into the past. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next one.